who live in Estonia who have an iPad, and we connect like on Skype, right? But I have to call them on their phone first, and then one of them says, okay, we're gonna fire up the device. And then they then we connect on the iPad. So it reminds me of that, like you're gonna get the device going, right?
Fantastic, and with that, we are live. So welcome everybody to OLC Innovate in Nashville. Virtually Connecting brings you there. And we're going to have a conversation with Kristen Eshelman moderating this group. We'll let themselves introduce themselves in a minute. But we'll start by introducing our remote participants, and then we'll go to the room. So Kyle, if you could briefly introduce yourself and tell us where you are.
I'm Kyle Johnson. I'm the CIO at Chaminade University, and I'm in Honolulu, Hawaii.
That's great. And Kyle is also one of the virtually connecting virtual buddies. Virtual, what do we call them? Advisor buddies. He's an advisor buddy. So good to see you, Kyle. Nate?
Oh, hi, I'm Nate Angel. I work at Hypothesis, the nonprofit that stewards open web annotation technologies and practices. And I'm in sunny Portland, Oregon.
It is sunny in Portland, Oregon. How about that?
It's a rare moment.
And I'm Michael Berman. I'm the Chief Innovation Officer at California State University Office of the Chancellor in Long Beach, California, where it rained this morning. So there you go. I think it's probably sunny now, though, but I can't quite tell from my office. And so I'll turn it over to you, Kristen, to introduce the team you've got there in Nashville.
Great. Hi, everybody. I'm Kristen Eshelman. I'm Director of Digital Innovation at Davidson College. I'm also one of the co-founders of the HAIL group, and have been working with one of Michael's colleagues, Joel Leifstead, on the steering committee. And this is a group of folks who attended HAIL a few weeks ago at Cal State Channel Islands. And so we wanted to talk a little bit about our experience there, juxtapose it to our experiences here in the context of innovation at the institutional level and the academic level. So I'll turn it over to Rob first.
Hi, everybody. I'm Rob Vanderlan. I'm an Associate Director of the Center for Teaching Innovation at Cornell University. And HAIL, this was my first association with HAIL. Conference at Cal State, or meeting at Cal State.
I'm the director of the Digital Education Incubator at Boston University, and it was also my first HAIL storm over at Camarillo. I'm excited to be here in conversation with you all.
And Romy, say your name again, because it got cut off by the lack of bandwidth.
Which part again? The whole introduction?
No, just say your name, because that part got cut off.
Romy Ruukel.
Perfect, thank you.
My name is Annie Sadler. I'm the Digital Learning Fellow at Davidson College, and the Hailstorm, the most recent one, was also my first one.
So that's all of us here at OLC. I think what might be of interest to those who are attending today is to learn a little bit about HAIL and our perceptions of that meeting, because it was a bit of a black box, I think. So I will just ask each person to talk a little bit about their perceptions of HAIL, what they thought were maybe the greatest insights that they had, and some of the challenges that they saw.
I go first? Who wants to go first?
You can go first.
All right, I'll talk a little. So I really loved the entire experience, maybe aside from the rain, which I felt was false advertising. I liked the small meeting model. I really liked the sort of intense 2-day time with a small group of people. I felt like I actually got to have conversations with almost everybody in the room at some time or another, which was great. I liked I found it really fertile ground to talk with people from very different kinds of institutions. I think if the goal is innovation, right, then those sorts of putting you up in conversation and dialogue with people really different, coming from different backgrounds, is really, really important. I also thought, maybe we'll talk more about this, I thought about some of the limits of a small group. And I've been thinking about that a lot at OLC the next couple of days, which it's big, it's impersonal, but you're also often in a room with very different, much broader group of people, and that group of people is changing, right? So you're superficial, but you're also encountering a wider range of perspectives.
That's true. I think I would echo those, especially the last sentiment. I think that's true. There's value in both kinds of gatherings. For me, what was great about Hailstorm was that that's as close to a professional association gathering type thing that I can get, right? Because one of the things that strikes me about there are so many people, of course I'm interested in talking to people who are not, are doing various different kinds of things within higher education and all of those things. But where do I get to meet with people who have similar titles to mine, who are in similar roles as me, or who are doing somewhat similar work, even if it's in very different places? Because I think it's not that Hailstorm was only at R1, right? Or only like there were people from different kinds of institutions and organizations there, and I found that valuable to sort of be people who were tackling some of the same questions, just in very different contexts. Now, I think that that's possible here too. It's just that you'd have to sort of go to some of these conversations, not presentations, gatherings, right? The ones where you sort of go from station to station and have those conversations, which some of what I've done, but short. So I like the various formats that the steering committee, that Allison and Kristen and others had put together in terms of the types of conversations we got to have within that. So for me, that was really valuable about Yale. I've also been thinking about what its limits are, and the sort of, right, as always, of what are the limits of small groups and invitationals and all of that. But to me, the value was in, everyone there was new to their role, was new to the kinds of problems that they had been tackling in the last little while. And so talking about those things together was interesting. I found it very recharging, re-energizing.
Hale was what I called my first conference. And now coming to OLC, I have seriously misused that word. I found Hale at the very beginning a little overwhelming. I was like, oh my gosh, there are 35 people. I don't know a single person here other than Kristen. How will I get to know them all? But it was exciting because over the course of the 2 days, I felt like I was able to talk to every single person or connect in some way. And some of my critiques of Hale were I didn't feel like we had as much like focus on students and kind of the reason why we were there driving the conversations. But in comparison to this OLC experience, I think it was doing a lot more of that. I think it was overwhelming. And I think I don't have the same drive to try and talk to every person because I can't, I physically can't do that. I think the presence of vendors really changes it all. It seems like there's a lot of emphasis on the actual technology and the tools, and the connection to students I haven't seen as strongly.
Well, it's funny you say that, right? So I had to come here, and I sent one of my teammates was at ASU GSD. So if you want to talk about like vendor conferences, you should just think about I don't know.
Yeah, it's
get
all
a report out
scale,
from there.
yeah.
Well, it's funny because I was thinking about you, Annie, in the session I was at just earlier this afternoon. It was about the relationships between vendors and institutions, how we can sort of innovate less inefficiently, more in a more streamlined way, and the role that vendors can play in that. And it was a nicely interactive session. We used a tool to generate questions and respond for everybody in the room. But there was who's most important in this entire process, and it's like the IT department, administrators, faculty, course content people, students, and the students were, you had slider bars to rate them, and the students did not figure highly. And I was So I was typing my, like, what we do, get students involved early and often.
Yeah.
I felt like I was channeling that perspective.
And I'll just add one more perspective that I've seen, which is more of a hostile approach to innovation, or an attitude toward innovation at OLC versus Hale, where that's what we're focused on and trying to build careers around. I found that to be kind of fascinating, and I'm wondering why the hostility is there, because the innovation is happening in both spaces, but that word has reached a point where some people feel they are not part of it.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to figure out why that is. And I wanted to make sure that we had some time for you guys to ask questions as well. And any comments on your end, Kyle or Nate?
I want to just follow up on that last point, and then I'll definitely Nate or Kyle, I want to make sure you get a chance. But do you think that, I want to connect the two things, this sort of questioning of the word innovation with the prominence of vendors at the conference? Do you think people kind of associate innovation with a kind of commercialism? Is that part of what's going on? And so when they hear innovation, they hear somebody's going to sell me something.
I think it's actually I'm guessing here, and you guys can chime in. My sense is that there are two levels of innovation, and people see themselves clearly in one of those, which is the incremental innovation space. And then there's that disruptive, radical innovation, and that's the one that I think the hostility is focused on, because it seems to be driven by a top-down approach at our institutions. That's my guess.
We could probably spend like an entire hour hacking like that, right? Just because I think that I think that hostility that you feel is real, or that criticism, right? Like it is, and even like what it's directed at. But it's not something I've encountered necessarily. I think it's more rather than hostility, right? Just to sort of like, well, like, it's not what you say that, but that's not what I do, or you say that, but that's not what we do, right? And it just sort of gets more like marginalized or identified away from, which I don't necessarily perceive as hostile, as more just like innovation is a buzzword, and that's not what we do. We are totally like transforming things. We're totally making that kind of incremental changes, or not even like, I think saying incremental can seem dismissive as well when we're talking about sort of these, again, transformative, but not necessarily like the tip of the spear kind of disruptive places. And we've actually, like at BU, we have started to think of those as separate, but as part of the same team, right? Our Center for Teaching and Learning and our Educational Technology group is engaged in that kind of transformative, which is still under Digital Learning and Innovation Office. And it's the incubator that does that sort of more edge casey kind of pilots and proofs of concept. I think as a way of trying to bridge and unify those kinds of conversations at BU. I see more of that here and in other places where some of that tension is felt, without losing the critique, a real critique of what's innovation that is out of touch with any kind of historical understanding of education or higher education in particular, or practicing and learning. I think that that's a dance that is a delicate one in some ways. But.
Yeah, I've definitely had the pushback, the hostility. One of the ways it's manifested in the last 2 days is a couple of times vendors have talked about, like, what problem do you need us to solve? And people saying, well, you're not going to actually solve any problems. Right? That's not how this works, right? It's the tool, whatever it is only one small part of that. And neglecting that is part of the problem. What I've been really fast on, a lot of emphasis about like relationships. Moving them from transactional relationships to sort of partnerships or collaborative relationships. On the one hand, seems deeply appealing. Who doesn't want to have a more tightly, a more human relationship? But also seems like an entering wedge. Like it's. I'm not sure I can put this into words, but it's often the vendor who's talking about developing this collaborative relationship, and it might be beneficial, but it's still transactional.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how and the conference, that issue's really live at a conference like this, where it's the vendor's money that's really bringing us together in the first place.
Yeah.
Great. Nate, did you want to follow up on your comment?
Sorry, I'm in somewhat of a noisy place, so I want to make sure that you guys can hear me okay. Great. You know, I've actually been in the shoes of being a vendor, both for commercial and for nonprofit educational technology organizations, I'll say, for lack of a better word. And I hear what you guys are saying really loud and clear. I've been thinking a lot lately about if educational institutions should consider their procurement practices more based around how close the tool they're examining is to their main focus of business. So when it comes to something like a commodity item like email, or maybe, you know, internet bandwidth or something like that, that's not, it may be core to your business. Yes, you need to have email and internet to do education, but you're not using functionality in them that's fundamentally different than anyone else's, then those might make sense to procure commercially. But when something is really central to the actual core of the educational process, it seems that that might be a good reason to hold it much closer to the vest in the educational institution itself and not expect to outsource that innovative level. Go ahead.
Sorry, we lost you there a little bit. Maybe.
Oh, dang it.
I think you said something.
It was so awesome. Yeah. So the end of it, and I could type it in too. I'm not sure whose bandwidth is at fault here. It could be mine.
I was able to hear you fairly well.
Okay.
Yeah, the point that Nate was making was that if something's a commodity that's like electricity or internet, you don't necessarily need to generate it yourself. But when you get really close to the teaching and learning process and the connection between faculty and students, that thinking that it's something you can go out and buy is something that I think a lot of people object to that notion, and they feel even offended by it. It seems to, in a sense, I think, trivialize the education process to suggest that it's a product that you can go buy, or that if you buy my product, all of a sudden the relationship, the experience the students have is better than it would have been without this product. Does that summarize pretty well what you were saying, Nate? Reactions from the group there? I'm curious what Annie thinks about that. As someone who's closest to the student experience. Put you on the spot, sorry. You now represent the voice of all students.
Right. Talk about tokenizing.
Yeah.
No pressure.
Yeah, I think that was something as a student I had no concept or understanding of what it meant to even have educational technology in the classroom. I was just told by my professors to use this tool, and there was no transparency about the larger teaching reasons for it. There also, and this comes from Sunday Richards, there was no conversation about what data am I giving these vendors. And I think I aligned to all of that until I started this fellowship this past year. And now when I am having conversations with friends who are still students, it's really interesting to hear them talk about it, because it's part of the landscape so much that they can't even think critically about how these tools are affecting their learning or how they as an individual are interacting with them.
Yeah, and
because they've never been asked to. I mean, right? It's the assumption that you go in the classroom, right? You trust that somebody's looking out for you, if you think about it at all. But often the faculty are no more wise to what's happening to data, who has access to that, who's selling it, who's seeing it, than students do. And I think it does begin with trying to make that more visible and asking people to reflect on it. It's a conversation starter, if nothing else.
I hope we're moving into a new era where we can really have those conversations, because I think that through most of my experience being involved with sort of educational technology and issues around it for the last 20 years, unfortunately, it's been defined by these dichotomies. It's like it's technology versus the Luddites, or it's, you know, the early adopters against everyone else, or it's, you know, the people who are the boosters versus the detractors. And I'm hoping that we can move beyond that kind of dichotomy to where there's sort of, that we can all become part of an intelligent dialogue about what is the value of different tools, how do they impact students, understanding, you know, I hope we've stopped saying the tool is neutral, right? It's like, it's just a tool, it's neutral. It's whether you, Facebook is just a tool, you can use it for good or bad, right? Google is just a tool, you can use it for good or bad. I mean, no, there are characteristics that are inherently good and bad about Google and about Facebook. And so it's not just how we choose to use them. Like, I'm going to use Facebook only for good, right? You know, I mean, I applaud a company like Hypothesis who really understands that. They're trying to build something that is culturally, has positive values built into the software, you know, and I'm sure somebody could critique it and say, well, that's not always true, and there's bad things about Hypothesis. But I think, you know, there are people, I think, who are, I would say, are ethical people in software and ed tech who are trying to build things that really benefit students. And then I think then we can critique it and say, are they successful at that or not just accept their goodwill. But it looks like, Rob, like you got something to say.
Yeah. So I hope this doesn't shift the conversation too much, but a number of you wrote pieces after Hail and shared them. I wrote one and didn't share it the way I typically do, but part of it was exactly addressing dichotomies. I come at Cornell, innovation, the word innovation is a fraught word. They're really on board with it, and some of them are in the administration. I came from the history department. The historians are not on board with it. They see it as part of the rest of the university and the destruction of everything they hold dear, to hyperbolize just a tad. But like, those dichotomies are really powerful. They help people make sense of the world. They're not going away. But when you get in the room, right, we had a bunch of people who cared deeply about education, who were thinking about innovation as a way to make education more effective, more equitable, more accessible, more inclusive. Those are the people that my colleagues in the history department would connect with, right? So how do we make that connection? And that's really how you build a coalition for innovation, whether we use the word or not.
Absolutely. I think three quick thoughts there, along with what you've been saying, just echoing. What some of what you were saying was calling to mind was this really interesting conversation that was led by Barbara Birkenmeier yesterday about sort of the history of education and looking at tools along the way. And she reminded me this thing that I firmly believe, but sometimes lose track of thinking, right? Which is similar to like what some marketing conversation is, but it's not wrong, which is that people mostly don't want tools, right? Like what they want is to connect with their loved ones, or they want to learn, or they want to like, right? Like you don't, in marketing, right? The way people talk about it, right? Is that like, people don't, what they want is to have a whole, right? Like, like, right?
The job's to be done.
Right, like it's the, and so I think part of these conversations that we sometimes lose when we have them with whomever, with each other, with vendors, whoever, right, is that we can lose track of what it is that, like, we get so into the tool or the product, right? It's like, well, what is it that actually like people want to do, and how do we get there? But only focusing on that, right, then loses some of the along the way, because it's like, well, people just want to connect, so Facebook does that, right? It like skips over like so many things along the way about what that means, and right. So I think it's like trying to keep both of those things in mind, right? Like not being tool centric, but really thinking about steps along the way that are more nitty gritty, right? Like it's the big picture, and then the like small steps that every time I feel like, and this is not hopefully belaboring the point, but I think every one of these small decisions along the way does question like our ethical and moral compasses, right? Decisions about new things, which brings me to my sort of third point quickly about the the hyperbole that you're saying, right? But that great story, right? And how like that exists when you're born is you don't even think of it as technology, right? It's just the air you breathe, right? And then like anything that comes into being before you have a technology, but anything that comes into being after you're 30 is an abomination and should not exist. And it's not even technology. And so I think that's, but hopefully, right, like along the way as we're considering technologies and as we resist the right of anything that comes into being after we're 30, that there's sort of wise and ethical decisions that we can make along the way and thoughtful ones. And I think that's what sometimes can be missing when we're only talking about tools. That neutral argument, right, loses the idea that we're being thoughtful about it.
That's great. That's fantastic. I'm glad we have that recorded so we can go back and listen to it again, because there's a lot to unpack in what you said there, Romy. We're just about out of time. I don't know, Kyle, you haven't had a chance. Is there anything you wanted to jump in briefly before we wrap up?
Yeah, see if I can just do a mic drop here right at the end. I'm sort of very curious about how these conversations change when we think about students who are primarily interacting online. I think when I looked, a lot of the Hail participants are, I would say, primarily face-to-face focused. And when the tool becomes the interstitial communications requirement, like how do you have a conversation about student agency and opting out when opting out literally means opting out of the entire experience? And so that's sort of what I struggle with as I listen to some of these things, because we have a substantive online community. So.
Okay, anyone want to take that for 30 seconds?
I'll try. I've been thinking a lot about that and about inclusivity. At Hale, we talked about trying to become a more diverse community, bring in more sorts of voices. The session I went to this morning was on creating inclusive environments in online spaces. Interestingly enough, our Hale group was largely white, not universally, but largely. This room there were probably 45 people in the room. There were 3 white guys, and it was predominantly women and women of color. And so, it's really interesting to see these conversations going on in different spaces and not across boundaries. And the conversation inclusivity online is really interesting, because a lot of students are sort of opting out of the face-to-face experience to choose online because they don't want to be like fully present. And yet everything we know about creating inclusive spaces is creating a space where you can be fully present and where everybody in the room can be. So I don't have an answer, but it's worth doing over.
Well, I think with that thrilling and positive thought, we'll go ahead and end the broadcast for the day. Thank you all who are watching, and thanks very much to the participants in Nashville. Excuse me, and the participants online. I'm going to stop the broadcast. You guys can go on talking. Thanks. I actually have to go to a staff meeting, so I'm going to head on out. And but thank you for joining Virtually Connecting.